Good afternoon. It's quite a crowd. Well, that's an incentive to our speakers to make sure that your presence is, your time here is well worthwhile. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Lipsky, and I have the great honor of first opening the session and inviting the Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF, to speak. The climate finance has been a cornerstone of IFI strategy, and it's increasingly important. It's an increasingly important mission, is balancing the traditional goals of the MDBs and the IMF, and with these new need to address climate finance. And to this end, first of all, I want to thank the organizers of this important event, the IFF, the Paulson Institute, and the Bretton Woods Committee, for joining together to organize such a panel on such an important topic, and to thank the IMF for hosting us. So with this, the proceedings will begin with an address by the Managing Director, and when that is done, then we'll invite the panel to join us, and we will have a discussion on these important topics, and hopefully we will have time for some questions from you from the audience. But without further ado, let me introduce the Managing Director.
Very good afternoon, and thank you all very much for being here. Wow, this is a full house. I'm checking whether there is a seat with my name on it, so I can invite somebody to take it. Is there one for me? Okay, so we can have one of the standing members to please enjoy a front row seat. John, I'm very grateful for the role you play, and here is the dedicated Managing Director for this particular session. I want to join John in thanking the International Finance Forum, the Bretton Woods Committee, and the Paulson Institute for pulling this event at a rather short notice, I must say. It was a year ago when the IMF's Executive Board approved the creation of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, adding a new lending instrument to our toolkit, and very importantly, a financial vehicle to complement and implement our climate strategy. The creation of the RST came at a time of extraordinary shocks. You all know that. We had the pandemic, then the war Russia launched on Ukraine, and that created this risk of us, under the pressure of the urgent, to lose sight of the most important existential challenge we face, this of a changing climate. And I'm so very grateful to my staff and to our board that we at the IMF have demonstrated ability to deal with the urgent and not lose sight of the important. As a former president of the World Bank, some of us work with, Jim Wolfensohn would say, to chew gum and walk at the same time. What is so very critical is that we have taken an extraordinary effort to make the RST operational in record short time. Anyone who knows the working of our institutions would understand that moving from board approval of instrument to having the first programs under this instrument in action within 6 months is not a trivial achievement. I am pleased to report that today we have the first 5 resilience and sustainability facility programs in place. This is the core of our pilot phase. We deliberately want to start with a limited number of programs so we can learn what works, what has to be improved as we scale up. But scale up we will. We have a very healthy queue of countries expressing interest, 44 of them, low-income countries and vulnerable middle-income countries. We are determined to work with each and every one of them and work with our partners so we can make best use of what we have created with the generosity of countries in strong reserve positions who have decided to on-lend through the IMF some of their dormant special drawing rights. Some of them are also adding financing from their own budgets. As strong our pipeline is, that strong is also our collaboration with our partners. I want to recognize the multilateral development banks. You would hear from some of them today. I want to recognize our colleagues from across the street, from the World Bank Group, whose intellectual contribution is extremely valuable, as is their long-standing tradition of working on issues of reducing emissions and helping countries be more resilient to climate shocks. So we have done well so far, but there is so much more we need to do. Why? Because what we learn from every single publication of IPCC and other scientific bodies is that the changes in our climate are happening faster, their impact is more dramatic, and our response in terms of cutting emissions and adapting to climate shocks is unfortunately still not at par with the challenge we face. Just to give you one number, we are to reduce emissions by half by 2030. We are not nearly in the vicinities of achieving that. So we have to think how we can accelerate adaptation to climate shocks, how we can accelerate the green transition. And a comprehensive and collaborative approach on 3 interrelated elements is crucial: adequate policies, investment and innovation, and financing. Let me give you an example on the policy front. This is the bread and butter of our institution, of the IMF. We look at countries, do they have healthy institutions? Do they have strong policies? And we aspire to support them so they have macroeconomic and financial stability that provides the ground for robust growth and employment. But if policies don't take into account the risks of climate shocks and the need to adapt to them, if they don't take into account the fact that a structural change in the economy is going to make some sectors over time stranded assets, and if you don't take into account the necessity for financial institutions to assess climate risks at par with other financial risks, we are not providing the policy support that countries need. If we don't look into their subsidies that may be encouraging harmful practices, and if we are not giving them advice how to put in place subsidies that underpin innovation for the green transition, in other words, healthy subsidies, we are not doing our job. And our board, and I see here one of our board members, there may be others, Mr. Nicol here from Australia, he represents a group of Pacific Island countries for whom what we discuss here is a matter of their very existence. If we don't do our job well to integrate climate policies in the way we think about sound macroeconomic and financial framework, we as institution would fail our members. When we think of policies, our strength is in 3 areas. Fiscal policies. What do you tax? How do you tax it? How you use the money? How you direct spending? And there we have very cute tools. One of them is CPIMA, Climate Public Investment Management Assessments. Help countries do that the right way and the most efficient way. We also do it through monetary policy. Can monetary policy be protective of long-term financial stability in a country? And we do it particularly actively through our role on data. Good data underpin good decision making. But if climate data is absent from macro data, then we are cutting the legs of policymakers. We are not giving them the tools they need. We are also very keenly interested to promote more investment, public and private, in research and innovation, both to accelerate the green transition, I'm sorry, I apologize, but also to create a strong momentum for productivity increase and future growth. So and of course, we in our name, we have the definition that we are an international financial institution. So we also have to impact the world of finance. And this is where the RST is particularly helpful. It is modest in size, 40 billion. Keep in mind, I'm talking from an institution that has a lending capacity of 1 trillion, of which 300 billion we have already deployed. So 40 billion is not a solution on its own, but it is a contribution to a solution if it helps remove barriers for massively scaling investment, especially private investment in emerging markets and developing economies. So, as you can see, I'm coming to the end of my voice capacity. I'm going to wrap it up. We are proud to be partners of Rwanda, Barbados, Costa Rica, Bangladesh, Jamaica, the first 5. We are proud to be partners of all our members on a very difficult and yet critical journey, one that would make our planet more resilient. Because if we fail on that, it really doesn't matter what else we achieve. Yes, inflation is painful, but we can survive it. Yes, recession is bad, but we can survive it. What we cannot survive is an unmitigated climate crisis. And I tell you, I have all the intention, for the sake of my daughter, my grandchildren, we survive and we prosper. Thank you.
Thank you. However,
There is a picture.
there's a photo op that we can't miss. Could I invite the panelists to join us on stage?
Thank you.
And thank you for that, for your remarks. And now the audience will, oh,
You're fine there, man.
yes, oh,
John.
yes, we had it choreographed, 3 on one side, 3 on the other.
I think you were studying here.
I did, yes, you're,
You're staying
Yeah.
right here.
okay,
You're next.
You're the first people.
okay.
Okay, you come here.
Now, there's a reason for the concern over the choreography, so that AV people know that to turn on the right mic at the right time. Any rate, thank you again to the managing director for joining us and for those interesting, important remarks. And we wish her well for the rest of the spring meetings that we know will contain some extremely important issues. And can this get pulled back? No. Nobody's going to do anything. Okay, sorry about folks over there. There we go. So we don't get any awards for the choreography, but hopefully the substance will justify it all. I have a certain amount of angst as having the honor of moderating this panel, and that angst is, this is really a fantastic panel. And I wish that you all had their bios in front of you, but you can find them on all of our websites, the Bretton Woods Committee, the funds, scheduling, the IFF, and the Paulson Institute. I could give a description, an adequate description of each one of the panelists, and we would run half an hour. So I'm going to introduce them by their mere titles, but I encourage you subsequently, because you'll be impressed by what they've told us today, to go back and look at their accomplishments. We have Deborah Lear, Vice Chair and Executive Director of the Paulson Institute. Bo Lee, Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. Jinli Kun, who is the President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Ken Lay, who's a Senior Managing Director of the Rock Creek Group, but I have to add, former Treasurer of the World Bank. Uzil Dajimana, my best try, Minister of Finance and Economic Planning of Rwanda. Thank you for joining us. And Vera Songwe, former Undersecretary General at the United Nations, currently at Brookings, and someone well known, I think, to everyone interested in this area. So let's welcome them all. And thank you. Now, to start this off, the Managing Director told us that the risk here, or one of the risks, is that the urgent takes precedence over the important. And in the area of climate finance, climate mitigation, that seems a perennial risk, as the more dramatic news of every day seems to distract attention. So here's a question to start. How do we, in fact, maintain focus on this important issue when it seems to be crowded out on a daily basis by the headlines that vie for officials' attention For example, the concerns about banking and financial sector. How do we maintain focus? So Lee, how do you see this?
Thank you, John. Well, the way I see this is that we are facing with many short-term challenges, as John just mentioned. But at the same time, if we look around the world, we will see many climate disasters almost every day, from heat waves in Europe to wildfires in North America, from droughts in Africa to flood in Asia. Climate change, climate disasters are impacting everybody. So let me start with the good news. The good news is that our member countries, 190 of them, we came together last year to create this new instrument at IMF, the Resilience and Sustainability Facility. This shows that even amid many challenges, our members, our member countries, they still put climate at the very top of their agenda. That's why we could pull this off last year to create this new trust and this new facility, the first ever long-term instrument in the history of the IMF, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. So that's the good news. It shows the commitment of our membership. It shows the commitment of 190 countries. That's the good news. But I also will mention a bad news. The bad news is that we are falling short. We need trillions of dollars going into clean energy, going into green projects every year. For renewable energy alone, we need $1 trillion a year. What we are mobilizing right now is only a fraction of that. So we need urgent action. We need unprecedented global cooperation. So in the midst of these many near-term challenges, I know our member countries are still putting climate change on the top of their agenda. That is why we at the IMF will continue to push the RST so that the issue of climate change will stay in the front of our mind every day. So I stay here. I stop here, thanks.
Thank you. Deborah, you've been working in this area to try to maintain focus, not just in the public sector, but private sector, in NGOs, other organizations. How do you see this? How do we maintain focus?
Great. Well, first, the Paulson Institute is delighted to be co-hosting this wonderful event. And one of the things that we do find encouraging is the change in political will. When we were discussing this, in fact, in the year that China, since we have somewhat of a China theme on this, was hosting the G20 meetings, the fact that they were the first to put green finance on the agenda, it wasn't all that long ago, and it was something that not a lot of people were talking about at the time, and the difference that we see today is significant. One of the other hats that I wear, as you say, in the private sector is I'm with Edelman, and we do a trust barometer every year. We've been doing it for over 20 years, and we find that 7 out of 10 people across the 28 countries that we survey feel this is one of the most urgent issues. And so we're seeing a change that this isn't just expectations for government to take action, but consumers are now saying they want to see action, that this is one of their biggest concerns after job loss. And so how do we start to address it? And I think the managing director made a really good point about the need to walk and chew gum at the same time, because we're not only finding that we have an existential threat when it comes to climate, but we have an existential threat when it comes to biodiversity. And the gap that we're seeing around biodiversity, when 90% of our large fish have vanished, since 1970 we've seen a drop in 70% in large vertebrates and mammals, that the increase in loss of our animal species is hitting 1,000%. It's staggering in terms of the loss. And it can't be that we wait until we address climate and then we start addressing biodiversity. We have to find ways to address them. And we see, just as Mr. Lee was saying, we see these weather events and other things, we're also seeing many of these other occurrences around biodiversity in terms of the loss. Just take, for example, annually, if we lose our little birds and bees and bats, if we can't turn them into some kind of asset class, 300 billion of our food supply is at risk just directly from pollinating. And then you add in secondary effects around animal feed and various issues like that as another 200 billion, that's 500 billion in loss to our food supply that's at threat. So these are issues I think that are starting to come to the people's attention. Some of the things that we've come out with the energy shocks and with COVID and other things have brought it really to the fore. Now we need to find ways to get government and the private sector working together, and of course NGOs and the multilateral institutions to address it.
Any other panelists want to comment? If not, yes, please.
Thank you. I would pick up your point of how we could stay focused on climate financing. And when this topic is resilience and sustainability financing. I think I agree. The awareness about the crisis of climate change has been greatly enhanced, no question about that, both the public and individuals. That's the positive side. But I would like to say, still, we need to further enhance the awareness of the general public about the crisis. Because unless you do believe this is going to be a crisis looming large on the horizon, it is not possible to mobilize sufficient resources for that purpose. So my view is only crisis survival would advise extraordinary measures. Give you one example. No government would say, we have huge surplus of resources. We don't know how to spend this money. Nobody would tell you that. But all of a sudden, after COVID-19 broke out, money was there. Dealing with the healthcare system, dealing with the vaccines, all of their money came. You know why? Because you adjusted the allocation of your resources. You think this is survival. So COVID-19 pandemic was really the survival crisis. And then all of a sudden, you have money. So if we are saying that we don't have sufficient resources, there's a shortage of so much money, this tells us you do not still regard this as a crisis. So I hope this is going to change. And so far, I think some people still think it's crying wolf. If you don't think it's crying wolf, you think the wolf is really coming, you would put up your gun, right? You'll be prepared. Please ask yourself, are you really braced for this kind of crisis? Do you think it's really that urgent? Now, we humans have lots of challenges. But if these kind of challenges are important for us to address, you still have to prioritize. For a lot of us, those kind of things you need to take care of are important. But if you think climate change is really a global disaster, then these are red herrings. So you need to stay focused.
Indeed. Let me put the question this way. If with regard to the public sector, I recall vividly in the run-up to the London G20 summit in April 2009, which occurred just before the Copenhagen COP, the issue before the G20 finance ministers was, should they be addressing climate change finance? And believe it or not, many members of the G20 said absolutely not. That this was a matter for the UN, this was a matter for the COP, that the finance ministers didn't know anything about it. Has that changed, that there's been more linkage between finance authorities and environmental authorities to be aware of the need to find, to fill the gap between need, expectations, and reality? Minister, how about from your point?
Thank you, moderator. On your question,
on the risk of losing focus on climate issues due to the existence of other shocks. I think my answer is that all shocks, from COVID-19 to climate change and Ukraine war, are overlapping and they all constitute a major threat to macroeconomic stability and to livelihoods of our populations. So focusing on one and leaving the others would be not right, particularly as opposed to pandemics, which may come and cause damages and go. Climate effects are with us for a longer period and require both immediate actions and continuous and consistent measures for both adaptation and mitigation. So in my view, the question is the solution is really to build resilience to all external shocks that may occur anytime in the future. And this is really the only way we can ensure resilience and sustainability. There's no choice between one or two shocks. They are all interlinked. Thank you.
Thank you. Vera, you have experience in, I think, trying to bridge this gap between perception of need and willingness to commit resources in the public sector around the world. How would you assess the progress we've made so far, and how do we go further, because we all perceive there's a very large gap?
Oh, thank you again for having me here. I think this is a really important conversation. And maybe if we just unpack it a little bit to see what we're talking about. I think when we ask, can we walk and chew gum, or can we do this or the other, we're already maybe creating the dichotomy. And exactly as you said, if you look at what we talk about when we talk about climate finance, what are we talking about? We're talking about three things, which we talked about in the report that I had the honor of authoring with Nick Stern and Amma Bhattacharya and a few others, because we chair the high-level panel on climate finance. We talked about three things: energy transformation, agriculture, adaptation and resilience, and natural capital. The energy transformation needs about $600 billion for it to happen. But what is the energy transformation? It is essentially saying we need Vietnam, we need South Africa, we need Indonesia, and a couple of others to move away from coal. It is saying that we need the African countries to go away from spending 30 cents per kilowatt on heavy fuel oil to do a just transition to gas, and eventually to use solar and cleaner technology. Some of that we know how to do and finance in the private sector. But there is a lot more that we don't yet know. And actually, for many of the developing economies, the big issue now is transmission and the policy environment around how you finance transmission. But the second big component of that, the resource need that we identified, which was $2.4 trillion between now and 2040 minus China, because we thought just for emerging market and developing economies, is the adaptation and resilience facility. And the whole conversation around adaptation and resilience, or loss and damage, when you go to the other side because you haven't adapted, so you end up in loss and damage, is really around how can we make adaptation more robust. We know, for example, on our continent, we're going to need about 100 million houses in Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, and a few countries. Are we going to build the same with South Turkey? If you build right, you're actually adapting, and so maybe then you don't face the climate shock. In East Africa, we have the locust shock and all that. These are things that are not, the Minister of Finance doesn't wake up in the morning and say, oh, locust, is it climate change or is it food insecurity? He has to deal with it. So he's actually doing it as he's walking. And I think that's an important basket. The last basket is the basket of natural capital. And there, I think there is something that we can do and do more and faster, because that is the basket that actually delivers resources to all of us. It's the carbon markets. It's the carbon financing. It's the carbon offsetting. We all talk about sort of the fossil fuel industries and the sort of extraordinary profits they've made in the last 2.5 years. But many of them are looking for offsets. And those offsets will be found in the developing economies. But we need institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and others, and they're already doing that, to standardize the processes, to build the markets so that they work effectively. And where the resilience, so this is sort of the three big buckets for climate. Then there is the financing side, and that's why we're here today to talk about the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. One of the big things we say in the report is that vulnerable countries like Barbados, and we talk about the Bridgetown Initiative, should not spend scarce public resources to fight climate because they don't have it. And that when they get hit by a climate disaster, we should immediately trigger things that we have triggered before, such as a debt service suspension initiative type thing. And I think this is where the IMF has really excelled in its sort of advanced thinking, to be able to provide that. The Resilience and Sustainability Trust, when maybe Kristalina talks about it, we don't realize it. But this is the first time the IMF is providing long-term, 10-year grace, 20-year capital. This is the kind of capital you need to fight climate change. Yes, you will crowd in private sector capital eventually, but really, we need concessional resources to do this and do this well until we can crowd in private capital. And I think that is the importance of the conversation that we're having here today, is how can we make sure that, first of all, before we think about crowding in private capital, we reduce the cost of the capital that exists, concessional capital, and we make sure that it can work for climate. But as we do climate, we're doing health, we're doing agriculture, we're doing education, and so it becomes one big conversation that we're doing. Now time is against us, so we have to do it quickly, we have to do it at scale, and we have to do it together.
Thank you. Now, that, I suppose, brings us right to the issue of the RST. Bolie, tell us about what you see as the role of the RST and how you anticipate at the fund it's going to work going forward.
Thank you. I think MD just mentioned that we have a very strong demand on RST, even though it's still a very young instrument. We have so far approved 5 programs the board has approved. And we have more than 40 countries in waiting. We have also got commitment from our advanced members of close to $40 billion. Of course, it's far from enough compared to the need. As MD put it, we don't think this is a solution, but we want to make a meaningful contribution to the solution. So how can we, sorry.
And how does the RST, in terms of, do the programs under that are supported by the RST differ from typical fund standbys, and how do they relate to the need for climate finance?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So what we do, how we do this is we require a member country to have a UCT program with us first. So the traditional upper credit tranche program will assure the macroeconomic and financial stability of the country. So based on that UCT program, we then introduce the RST program. The RST program is primarily focused on long-term challenges, long-term balance of payment challenges, because we are an institution created to help our members to deal with balance of payment challenges. And RST was created to deal with long-term challenges, not the current. The current challenge in BOP, in balance of payment, should be dealt with by the UCT program. And for the long-term challenge, of course, we realize the long-term challenge, one of the key challenges is climate change. So we work with the members to develop policy reforms, to develop capacity building, so that the country can move towards a long-term sustainable development path. And we work with our partners, with World Bank, with other MDBs. So in terms of going forward, how we see this will work is that we want RST to play a catalytic role. I mean, that's what our members want. That's our board wants. To play a catalytic role by not only supporting the transformation ourselves, but also bring our partners, MDB partners, bilateral donors, and also private sector, as Vera just mentioned. So how can we play that catalytic role? We think it's important to think about climate finance from a holistic approach. Holistic means that we need to think about climate finance both from a policy environment perspective, from capacity building perspective, and also from financing instrument perspective. So we need to look at climate finance from all these perspectives in order to crowd in private capital. For example, for policy environment, we need clarity, we need policy clarity for the market to see what this country is committed to in terms of climate. We also need policy incentives. For example, carbon pricing, right? If we have the proper carbon pricing, we're going to send the right signal to the private sector. So that's one, the policy environment. The second bucket will be what we call capacity building, right? Because many of our developing country members, low-income country, vulnerable middle-income country, their capacity is limited. So we need to work together, the international community will need to work together with these countries to build capacity in these countries. The capacity in terms of public finance, the capacity in terms of public investment management, the capacity in terms of public financial management, and also the capacity to develop a pipeline of projects that are investable by investors. So all this require capacity. So that's the second bucket, the capacity building. And the final bucket I would call financing instruments or financing arrangements. We need blend public capital with private capital. We need to create de-risking arrangements so that private capital will find the risk-return profile attractive. We need to also scale up. Scale up means we need to standardize products. We also need to think about regional approach if we are facing with a number of small countries, because we need to have some scale to attract private capital. And we also need to think about leverage. How can we leverage public capital? How can we leverage program? How can we leverage project so that private sector can come in? So all these three buckets we think are all very important if we want to scale up a climate finance. The policy environment, the capacity building, and the financing instruments. And we are, in the context of RST, we are experimenting with this. We are working with MDBs, we are working with bilateral partners, we are working with private sector investors, and we are working with the country authorities to see if we can have strong collaboration between public and private so that we can deliver this package of these three buckets to crowd in private capital. I stop here.
Thanks. Mr. Jinlikun, is the AIIB view this initiative positively? Do you think it's the focusing in the right way? And will your institution be collaborating with the fund in these programs?
Thank you. I just follow up on Lee's comments. I think, first of all the multilateral development banks, MDBs, need to work together. And also with IMF, working in close collaboration makes a lot of sense. Because we believe if all of the MDBs are leveraging their resources to promote private sector participation, you can have more than what you can do by working on your own. And as I said, the positive side is more and more people are becoming aware of the importance of climate financing. So we take this very seriously. For instance, in our bank, AIIB has the corporate strategy, which stipulates that by 2025, 50% of the approvals would be for climate financing. We achieved this 2 years ahead. Last year, it's already more than 56%. And also, when we move forward to increase the private sector, all those private sector money are also would be allocated for climate financing. As I said, if we do really believe climate change is a crisis, then there shouldn't be shortage of resources. You need to allocate. You need to take this as the crisis, survival crisis. That's what we think we need to do. And also, when MDB work together, one of the most important impact we have on the client members is the government will take this very seriously. when the World Bank, ADB, AIIB, and EBRD are working together, they say, oh, this is very, very serious. That, in my view, would be a boost to the improvement of the regulatory policies. I still believe it's not a matter how much you subsidize, it's a matter how you do it. And it's an issue of how we can make the best use of resources. So far, there's lots of talk about money, we are short of money, but not enough attention is paid to how most effectively we can spend the money. That's something, in my view, seems to be a missing point.
I think an excellent point. Vera, is it fair to say that a climate-aware carbon pricing policy is a litmus test for seriousness in this area? Or is it just a nice to have? Or is it a must have?
I think it's a must-have, and we have seen the difference between the voluntary carbon markets in Europe and the sort of mandatory carbon markets. They are a size of $900 billion versus $3 trillion of the market. And I think the more we look at the private corporate sector, they are actually quite interested in offsetting. Most of the shareholders now want to contribute to offsetting carbon. The question is they don't want to get blamed and put in the greenwashing category. So there is a little bit of a scale. And I think that this is where, again, with the MDBs working together, there's a dearth of information on how one can harmonize and systematize the verification, the monitoring, data. I think that is the most important part. If we can deliver the data on carbon pricing, we will actually be able to raise the resources. I say that carbon pricing and carbon today is the sort of next big commodity boom, if we can do it right. Not just because we do it for the Minister of Finance, but also because we do it for the local communities. And so we actually spread the wealth. There's a lot more fiscal space, and the benefits are spread across the different geographies and the different individuals. So it's a much faster poverty-reducing initiative and regenerative initiative as well.
Great, thanks. Well, now we've set the stage for the toughest question of all, because we've all agreed that there's progress being made on the policy side. There are big financing gaps, that the totals are so large, the necessary totals are so large, there's no chance that the public sector is going to come close to meeting it. So private sector finance is going to have to be mobilized. And that will turn to Ken Lay, who has, back when he was treasurer of the World Bank, was actually famous in the private sector as an innovator in terms of finance. And now that you straddle both the NGOs and the private sector, how do we go about raising private finance to fill these gaps? Is it doable? And if so, how? And are we headed in the right direction?
Yeah, and that obviously gets to the heart of this issue. And just to put this in some perspective, what we're trying to figure out here is we know that the official sector resources are not going to be adequate by themselves to tackle this. We also know that we have got a global savings pool that's a couple $100 trillion that is being actively invested. A lot of it, what continues to strike me is that we still we don't see the custodians of that global savings pool actually feeling that they're seeing these issues presented to them in ways that they can take to their investment committee. And they can they're still having conversations about, well, what was the last, how did we do in the last quarter in our performance and all of that? Well, that's the real world in which we're dealing with this. And I think we really need to begin to engage a lot more with the people who are actually overseeing the decisions that a lot of the custodians of this global savings pool are actually responding to. And I've seen examples that I think we could begin to tackle this, but there are entities around. I know one of them quite well. They have $2.3 trillion under advisement, and the comment from the CEO was, Well, can that world that you're existing in back there in DC, we never hear from them. And they have no incentive to go to the pension funds and the state sovereign wealth funds that they advise and do anything other than the traditional approaches to their investments. And I think there is some very interesting work going on which could begin to change some of this. And I think, for example, if there can be a much more disciplined approach to quantifying the risks that are associated with the issues that we're talking about today, that will help the people making these decisions to become more comfortable incorporating this into their asset allocations. And I think the other issue we've got is that we need to be focusing very closely on which allocations do we really need to access for this. If I look at a typical pension fund asset allocation, they've got, maybe 10% in private equity. Well, there's a lot of very creative work going on in that area, and it produces good returns, but it is not the scale, and it can be quite costly. So what we need to do is to focus very sharply on accessing the lower cost, larger allocations in these funds. Well, we know what that is. It's high-grade liquid fixed income. And our Bretton Woods institutions have done an excellent job at that for a very long time. We now need to figure out how can we achieve this with, there's the discussion now in the evolution that we're talking about whether we will leverage up places like the World Bank and all that. And we can have a detailed discussion about whether that is going to make sense. But there are other ways too. When we talk about the RSTs, you alluded to the proverbial halo effect, that if investors see that these programs are in place, their thinking about risk begins to change, and the rating agencies' thinking about risk begins to change. And I think, but a number of the institutions have been reluctant in the past to make what I would call explicit use of that halo effect, because then they're worried that will, in some respects, undermine their preferred creditor treatment or what have you. And so these issues are all out there, but I think there are avenues to get through it. And I think if we can, there is potential to get much broader engagement at much greater scale on the priority issues that Vera and others have identified here. But I do think we need to get that group who are allocating this and custodians of this huge savings pool much more engaged and ask them much more. What do you need to see here? How can we respond?
Yes, but if I could go one step further, oftentimes that conversation is the public sector needs to guarantee, underwrite the risks. That strikes me as not necessarily a very successful avenue. It's going to be more complicated than simply saying the public sector is going to take the risk and the private sector is going to keep the goodies.
That's exactly right. And if we had this discussion at the World Bank years ago about using guarantees and everything. Well, that was fine until you started talking to the accountants and they said, well, we're going to have to charge your exposure under those guarantees against your capital. Well, all of a sudden, there's no free lunch. And I think that's why we really have got to
So fair enough to say, no magic answers yet.
That's it. There's no, yeah.
But a lot of work can be done.
Yes.
And needs to be done.
Right.
But hasn't been done yet. I'm tempted to say, why not? Uli, go ahead.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Ken just said. Just two quick points. One is that Precisely as you suggested, we are starting to engage with private sector investors, the custodians, the big money managers, the pension funds, to hear what they need to get into this space. In fact, tomorrow morning we're going to have a closed-door climate finance roundtable. To both public sector and private sector will sit down together to talk about this. We also are traveling to all the major financial centers, New York, London, Singapore, to meet with them. As I said, we think strong collaboration between public sector and private sector is needed if we want to scale up. So that's my question number one. My point number one. My final point is that I also very much agree with you that de-risking is not the only element. De-risking, as you mentioned, private sector always say, oh, public sector needs to come in to take the first loss or provide guarantees so that we can come in. That is partially correct. But as John said, there is also a big moral hazard issue there. If we are privatizing gain and socializing loss, that's not a good arrangement. So we need to find a better de-risking arrangement so that there is a symmetry of risk and return. We don't want to have asymmetry in a way that creates a lot of moral hazard. But more importantly, de-risking is only one element among the holistic approach I just described, because we need policy environment, we need capacity building, and then we need financing instrument. And that financing instrument may include some de-risking element, but that's not all. So that's why we talk about a holistic approach. We need really these three buckets to work together if we want to deliver, if we want to scale up climate finance. Thanks.
Minister, you wanted to make a point, and then Deborah, and then Vera.
Yes, I want also to echo my predecessor on the fact that globally resources are there, but they don't flow to the countries where they are the most needed. And there are different reasons that we need to address. From policies and the economic environment, the legal, institutional frameworks, and how we address the risks. So there are a number of things we need to work on, and actually the work has started. I will come back to it. And so that private resource can flow. Otherwise, the public resource will be never enough, given the gaps you mentioned between the climate financing needs and the resources available. The needs are estimated in trillions. What's available is in billions, so the gap is huge. So we need to mobilize all possible instruments to catalyze the private financing. RST is a good initiative to start with, but resources available are not enough. There is more work to mobilize resources to increase the funds so that more countries can benefit, but also can receive significant amount given the needs. But it has two important components. One, it supports policy reforms in the countries to ensure macroeconomic stability, which takes into account the climate risks with necessary buffers to mitigate potential shocks. But number two, it provides long-term resources, affordable resources, for countries to implement those policies and to also implement their climate agenda. It is not enough, but it is considered as a catalytic fund. Now, the second step is what we are working with the IMF. Mr. Bori is our coordinator. We're trying to discuss with all different partners to see, to explore options for using the RST to catalyze more private capital. So in the case of Rwanda, we are already at early stage, but we are seeing different options. We have launched a climate fund that we want to use to see how we can attract more capital investment, but there are things to do, including using part of RST to reduce, to lower the cost of financing, but also to see how we can attract grants and other concessional loans to make sure that the pooled resources will be affordable to local investors. These issues also related to forex risk, which we also need to address, especially for the foreign investment. So we are still working on these options, and then this week we will meet again with all partners under the leadership of Mr. Boli to continue the discussion. But we see there is a potential to maybe to double or to triple the size of RST we have received as the country.
Great. Well, that's very encouraging, I'm sure. Deborah, you wanted to speak.
So our chairman, Hank Paulson, is also the chairman of the Rise Climate Fund. And he believes very much that we're on the verge of a climate industrial revolution with ideas like the RST coming out, very innovative ideas on financing with the IRA, with the subsidies coming out in Europe, with the financing that we see in China, that it is going to be providing capital to many of the kinds of solutions that we need and on a massive scale, and that those solutions, which some may exist now, some may not, that's where a lot of the money is trying to go. It will start in the developed world and continue on then into those countries, sometimes who need it most. But it requires that we be very smart about how government policy works and the roles, right, that the MNCs continue to play in this. And that we be very careful, too, about the kinds of subsidies that we have. As we go back to biodiversity and looking at that, $700 billion financing gap, which I think in this room isn't necessarily a lot of money. In the global world, it's less than the world spends on soft drinks every year. It's relatively insignificant. Half of that can be achieved without spending any new money on biodiversity, simply by addressing perverse subsidies that subsidize the production of crops, right, that are not good for the biosphere. So lots of opportunities.
Vera, did you have an additional point?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say very quickly, I think one of the things that Kristalina and Boli have also mentioned is that we're here today talking about the RST because we got SDRs. I don't want us to lose sight of that. SDRs were an important equity injection that we got into the global economy. And I think it would have been impossible for us to design an RST without having that kind of affordable, cheap capital to do it with. And so two things. One, we need more SDRs to make sure Kristalina said there are 44 countries. I'm sure there are more. And I think if we did not have SDRs to solve this kinds of global precipice, emergency issues, then the question is, what else would we use SDRs for? And I don't know what the answer is. So I think that is, for me, in some sense, probably the most urgent thing is, can we get the additional $1 trillion of SDRs that are out there, or a new issuance of SDRs, to make sure that we can address this issue. The second thing is really around the cost of capital. And essentially, SDRs do the equity for us, philanthropy does some of it. But at the end of the day, globally, in many of the emerging market economies, the Forex, the cost of market capital, Eurobonds, is so prohibitive that, I spend my time now trying to bring down with the liquidity and sustainability facility cost of capital. It's going to be very difficult for us to fight this fight if we do not have instruments that can blend cost of capital like the SDRs to make it happen. So I think at the end of the day, it really is also about that financing and the scale at which it can come.
Yes.
I think from the perspective of the MDBs and IMF, we believe we really can contribute a lot. But we should not exaggerate the roles we can play. All of the money put together is very much limited. It's a drop in the bucket. For instance, guarantee can help mobilize private sector resources. But how much money? could coming out of that. My view is there's still a lot of things all of the governments need to do to improve the policy environment, regulatory environment. And as Mr. Li Bo said, you're trying to do this. I'm thinking about this. For instance, what are the risks faced by the private sector investors in the renewable energy or in the climate financing? What are the real risks? De-risking is important, but what are the risks? In terms of engineering, it's already very mature. Solar panel, the efficiency is improved substantially. The risk is the private sector investors are not sure my investment and its products would be really helped with the economy and help us to achieve decent, reasonable return. For instance, give you one example. The renewable energies generated by solar panel or wind are intermittent. And the power grid are most reluctant to take them. And they don't believe this could be serving as the base load. Okay, base load could still, for some time to come, provided by other kind of things. But eventually you have to phase out coal, gas, or something like that. Is it possible for the government to guarantee that the energy you produce, power, electricity you produce, must be taken by the state grid? There's no way you can reject them. So we are not talking about actually technical engineering risks. It's really the policy. It's really the regulatory risks that matters. Until that problem is resolved, I don't think there's much hope for you to induce private investors to be actively participating in investing in climate financing. I think this is a crucial issue. So we need to look at that. And also IMF support should also be targeted at those countries which would improve this kind of policy environment.
Ken, any further insights on incenting the private sector?
Yeah, I think these points are hugely important, but I think we have got to be realistic, because even if we were to pull together let me call it a regulatory template for the reforms that would begin to bring some confidence into this, we still have a very long way to go to begin to attract the large-scale financing on affordable terms. And there have been times when I've been familiar with the power sector in some of the emerging market countries, and people there are going to be asked to pay 3 times for their electricity what people are paying in the Western United States. And while that's happening, it's very difficult for an investor, I don't know, a state teacher's pension fund or whatever, to look at this and say, I can get in there and provide this financing. And especially if you want them to do it on terms that, people can actually afford. It's quite remarkable. I see very interesting projects, but when they will offer, quite attractive returns. But then you focus in on who's going to have to be paying to support those returns. And it's people in impoverished places where you say, well, is that really what we're trying to do? But I think having said all that, there are solutions to this. And I think if we can the work that is coming under the RSTs and all of that, I think can begin to tackle some of these problems.
Thanks very much. Well, we're running down, in fact, we're into, I guess if you're a football fan, penalty time, but in the, let's call it bonus time instead. We can take a couple questions from the audience. Gentleman right there, yes. Please wait for, is there a microphone coming, I hope? There we go. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, panelists. I'm Stephen from the George Washington University. And my question is how to stimulate and incentivize low-capacity countries to grow their capacity when they are already facing with an array of fundamental problems, such as even like securing a proper energy grid, feeding their people, and other fiscal problems. Thank you.
Well, I think one answer is apply for the RST. But anybody? I don't know if we have anything to add from what we've already said.
Well, sometimes the policy that is needed and the incentives that you finally put in place actually end up being cheaper, right? So there is a cost savings, and that's how we incentivize. So there is maybe when you do the cost-benefit analysis, if you're borrowing in local currency, I hasten to add, then if you look at, for example, we go back to adaptation and resilience. Re-terracing and remanaging your green spaces can actually lead to greater agricultural productivity and cheaper food, and maybe more business and more taxes. So there is a stream there that is possible to do, but it starts with good policies. So there are some positives.
Yeah, I agree with Vera. I will add that two more points. One is that one way to incentivize low-capacity countries to come to us is that we're going to combine RST with a traditional program, as I said, because our traditional program will help this country to establish a sound macroeconomic framework, so that that will lay a foundation for hopefully for long-term development. Another additional aspect is that we typically combine our financing program with capacity building. So we are not only going to lend to them, we're also going to provide technical assistance for them in terms of their fiscal policy framework, monetary policy framework. So this kind of capacity building help, this kind of technical assistance, is additional, I think, incentive for this country to come to us.
Great, thanks. Down here.
Whitney Debevoise from Arnold and Porter. Hypothetically, if I were an advisor to a DMO, what should I be telling them about how to go about getting the requisite policy input, technical assistance, and financing for a good green bond? Let's say, for example, for avoided deforestation. I know a number of DMOs are already supposedly getting advice from MDBs, but they've been at it for more than a year, and they still don't have a green bond.
By the way, does
is there
everyone
anything
know
we
what a
can do to speed
DMO
this
is?
up? Oh, Debt Management Office,
Thank
the
you.
people who issue the debt of countries. Is there anything we can do to speed that up? Because I just see a lot of shifting around. Think of, Urasangwe was asked, is it important to have a price for carbon? The answer seems to be yes, right? So, what can we do to bring that about? For example, in a field like avoided deforestation, can we not identify the 5 or 6 countries with the largest forest cover and say, let's work together and get this done in 6 months or 12 months?
Thanks.
Whitney, I think that's a very good question. And I don't know about sort of the other geographies, but in the African geography, the 2 African countries that have issued green bonds, it is so onerous because of verification, because of the data requirements, because of the lack of standardization and harmonization, that none of them want to do it again. And so I think that that's the important point, is that we must be able to build a harmonized, and so the Africans have gotten together to sort of start an African Carbon Markets Initiative, which will help with that standardization. But right now, green bonds are much more expensive than plain vanilla bonds on the continent, and I almost will not even advise anybody to try.
Mm-hmm. Ken,
Just to follow up on what Vera just said, this is a big issue that those of us who are working on trying to deal with these problems, we have to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because you can have a discussion on the avoided deforestation front, on this verification issue and everything else, the people who are coming forward with the resources, well, they want to make absolutely certain that everything is going well. And that creates huge costs and delays and disincentive, whatever incentive there might have been to try to take advantage of what's on offer gets undermined because people say, look, the cost of all of this is going to be so high, so let's just move on, you know.
One more question here.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. In the green transition, I believe like there's gonna be an effect on jobs, especially for the lowest extracts of the society and the most vulnerable individuals. So how does a mechanism like this will support those individuals that are usually left behind and support to build resilience among the poorest in society?
Who wants to speak to this?
I can start. In fact, we regard 3 elements are very important for green transition. The first one we call carbon pricing. The second one is climate investment and climate finance. The third goes to your question, which is what we call just transition. We want this transition to be just. We want to make sure those vulnerable groups, those vulnerable regions are supported in this process. So that's why in our policy advice, when we think about carbon tax, we see one good use of carbon tax revenue is to support those vulnerable people, to support those regions that are left behind. And in addition, our RST program, the reason we give them long-term money is partly that money, one part of that money can be used to support those people, those regions that may be hurt in this process. And our calculation has shown that if we have the proper policy, the cost of transition will be manageable, and the cost of inaction will be much larger. So that's why we cannot wait. We have to transition to a greener future.
I think that's appropriate that we leave the IMF to have the final word and to be in favor of justice. If I can conclude, this has been a terrific panel, wonderful panel, and you can sense what I come away with a sense of energy, a sense of urgency, a sense of inevitability, and a sense of realism. In other words, we're not just posturing anymore. We're really looking for solutions, recognizing that this is a big ongoing challenge. We're not going to solve it simply. It's not going to be solved quickly, but it is going to require a lot of focus, a lot of energy, and a lot of decision making. And it seems to me, if we can judge from the attitude of the panel, that it's possible and we need to get on with it. I hope you all agree with that, and I hope you will join me in thanking this terrific panel for a wonderful session. And I'd just like to conclude where I began by thanking the sponsors and organizers of this session, the International Finance Forum, the Paulson Institute, and the Bretton Woods Committee. Tomorrow, the Bretton Woods Committee annual meeting begins at 4 o'clock. We have, again, the managing director. It's going to be next door in HQ1, where the IMFC used to meet. And it will include further remarks by the managing director, by President Malpass, and we're going to have a wonderful sessions. I hope all of you will join us there tomorrow. Thank you again. Thanks for coming, and thanks to the panelists.